In this video, the narrative presents euhemerism, an ancient theory that argues that many Greek gods originated from real human figures, later transformed by human memory. The journey begins in ancient mythology, moves through ancient paganism, and explains why some thinkers were accused of atheism for questioning the cult of the gods. It then follows how Jewish authors within Hellenistic Judaism and writers of early Christianity reused the same explanation. The narrative continues through the divinization of heroes and kings and the role of ritual veneration and ancestor cults. Centuries later, this line of thought reappears in the studies about the historical Jesus and the construction of myth. Throughout this trajectory, the video connects ancient religion, the history of religions, and modern debate. It is this continuous historical path that guides the entire narrative.
Throughout the history of religions, different societies have sought to explain the origin of gods, myths, and religious cults. At this point in the narrative, the focus is placed on the ancient Mediterranean world, where ancient mythology, ancient religion, and human memory were continuously intertwined. The proposal is to trace how religious belief was constructed, preserved, and transformed over time. The emphasis lies on the relationship between human figures, ritual veneration, and processes of divinization. The analysis moves through Greek, Jewish, and Christian traditions within their specific historical contexts. From this framework, the narrative advances to bring together the discussed elements and close the historical path presented. If you enjoy this type of video, be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and activate notifications to watch more videos like this.
Euhemeris appears on the intellectual stage of the Hellenistic world as a thinker interested in reinterpreting ancient mythology through historical and human narratives. Likely active between the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, he lived in a period marked by the cultural expansion of Greece following the conquests of Alexander, when different religious traditions began to coexist and be compared. In this environment, Greek mythology ceased to be merely a collection of sacred stories and began to be examined as a product of human memory and cultural transmission. It is within this context that Euhemeris proposed an alternative explanation for the origin of the gods, distancing himself from traditional interpretations of ancient paganism. His approach does not abolish the cult of the gods, but shifts its origin toward the realm of history and human experience. Ancient religion, in this reading, comes to be observed as the result of historical processes accumulated over time. This movement marks the formal beginning of what would later be called euhemerism. The main work associated with Euhemeris is known as Sacred History, a text that has not survived in full, but whose content is known through quotations and summaries by later authors. In this work, Euhemeris constructs a narrative that presents itself as a travel account, blending elements of geographic description, cultural observation, and religious reflection. The literary device of travel allows philosophical ideas to be introduced in an accessible manner without the abstract tone typical of theoretical treatises. Ancient mythology in this format is approached from an apparently concrete and observable setting. Euhemeris describes customs, temples, and written records found in distant lands, linking ancient religion to human history. This narrative strategy brings the theory closer to the reader and makes it harder to dismiss as mere speculation. Thus, euhemerism is born already integrated into a coherent historical narrative. At the center of Sacred History is the description of the island of Pangaea, a place presented as remote and little known in the Greek world. According to the account, this island housed a great temple dedicated to Zeus, where ancient records concerning the origin of the gods were preserved.
These records do not portray Zeus as an eternal deity, but as a human ruler who once exercised political and administrative power. The presence of inscriptions and documents reinforce the idea of an organized memory preserved institutionally. At this point, Euhemeris clearly introduces the principle of progressive divinization. The central figure of the cult of the gods comes to be understood as the result of a historical process rather than an immediate supernatural emergence. Greek mythology, in this account, gains a concrete historical foundation. The temple ceases to be merely a sacred space and becomes also an archive of human memory. By presenting Zeus as a historical king, Euhemeris shifts the focus of mythology toward the history of religions. Zeus does not appear as a primordial cosmic entity, but as a political leader who, after death, was elevated to divine status. This elevation does not occur instantly, but over time through ritual veneration and the repetition of cult practices. Human memory plays a central role in this mechanism, preserving deeds, amplifying narratives, and consolidating religious belief. The cult of the gods, from this perspective, arises from collective remembrance and the institutionalization of that remembrance. Heroes and kings come to occupy the sacred sphere through tradition and ritual continuity. This explanation offers a historical reading of the origin of the Greek gods. Euhemerism thus proposes a human genealogy for the divine. This interpretation is not limited to Zeus, but extends to other gods of ancient mythology, who come to be seen as former rulers, lawgivers, or benefactors of humanity. The narrative pattern repeats itself. An individual exercises power, performs notable deeds, dies, and over time is incorporated into the religious pantheon. Divinization appears as a consequence of collective memory and the need to preserve the authority of these figures. Ancient paganism in this reading is not denied, but reinterpreted as the outcome of continuous historical processes. Ancient religion ceases to be viewed solely as revelation and comes to be understood also as cultural construction. Religious belief becomes anchored in human events transformed by tradition. This explanatory model becomes the core of euhemerism. Euhemeris's proposal provokes immediate reactions within the Greek intellectual environment, as it challenges traditional understandings of the gods. By suggesting that the deities had human origins, he relativizes the separation between the divine realm and historical reality. This convergence of history and religion generates tensions within the religious thought of the period. Some perceive the theory as a threat to the cult of the gods, while others interpret it as an attempt to rationalize Greek mythology. The debate centers not only on the existence of the gods, but how they came to be and how they were remembered. Human memory in this context assumes a structuring role in religion. Euhemerism begins to circulate as an alternative explanation, opening space for new readings of ancient mythology. This initial movement prepares the ground for later appropriations of the theory. By the end of this first formulation, euhemerism establishes itself as an interpretive key for the origin of the gods within the history of religions. Euhemeris does not propose the elimination of religious belief, but its reorganization in historical and human terms. Ancient mythology comes to be read as the result of processes of myth construction over time. The figure of the historical Zeus functions as a central example of this logic, showing how ritual veneration transforms human leaders into gods. This approach creates a direct link between heroes and kings, ancestor cults, and ancient religion. The theory, still largely confined to the Greek environment, already shows potential to be applied beyond it, finding new forms of interpretation in different traditions. It is from this foundation that euhemerism will begin to expand beyond Greece, encountering new contexts and new historical uses.
The island of Panchaea is introduced in sacred history as a distant territory located outside the traditional axis of the known Greek world. Euhemerus describes this space as organized, prosperous, and marked by well-established religious practices, creating from the outset a sense of plausibility. The narrative avoids a fantastical tone and instead privileges geographic, social, and institutional details, bringing ancient mythology closer to a historical account. The presence of cities, temples, and political authorities reinforces the impression of concrete reality. In this setting, ancient religion appears integrated into daily life, without a rigid separation between political power and the cult of the gods. The island functions as a microcosm in which human memory, religious belief, and social organization coexist. It is within this space that the logic of euhemerism begins to take shape narratively. At the center of the island, Euhemerus places a great temple dedicated to Zeus, presented not only as a site of ritual veneration, but also as a repository of ancient records. The temple houses inscriptions and documents that recount the history of past rulers, preserving the community's collective memory. These records do not describe supernatural feats, but political, military, and administrative actions carried out by human leaders. Ancient religion, at this point, emerges as a continuation of civic history rather than a rupture from it. The cult of the gods comes to be understood as an extension of the respect and remembrance granted to former rulers. The presence of archives within the sacred space reinforces the idea that divinization is linked to the institutional preservation of memory. In this way, the temple becomes a symbol of a gradual transformation of the human into the divine. Among the records described, Zeus appears as the central figure, identified as a king who ruled over broad territories and organized laws and customs. Euhemerus presents the historical Zeus as a leader whose authority was recognized during his lifetime and perpetuated after his death. The narrative emphasizes a sequence of human events, avoiding the traditional mythical elements of Greek mythology. The ruler's death does not end his influence, but inaugurates a new stage of ritual veneration. Human memory preserves his deeds, amplifies their significance, and places him within the sacred sphere. The cult of the gods, in this case, emerges as a direct consequence of this continuous preservation. The island of Panchaea thus offers a clear narrative model for the origin of the gods. The description of the rituals performed in the temple reinforces this historical logic of divinization. Religious practices are presented as acts of collective remembrance, repeated across generations. Sacrifices, festivals, and ceremonies do not celebrate an abstract entity, but the memory of a ruler who structured the community. Ritual veneration functions as a mechanism for fixing religious belief, ensuring its transmission over time. Ancient mythology, in this context, appears as the cumulative result of these repeated practices. The cult of the ancestors blends with the cult of the gods, forming a continuous line between history and religion. The island of Panchaea makes this process of transition visible. Euhemerism thus gains a concrete ritual foundation within the narrative. Euhemerus expands the scope of the narrative by suggesting that the model observed in Panchaea is not exclusive to that location. The island functions as a concentrated example of a process that would have occurred in various regions of the ancient world. Heroes and kings of different peoples would have been following similar trajectories, being remembered, venerated, and ultimately divinized. Human memory appears as the unifying element of these experiences, regardless of specific cultural context. Greek mythology, in this sense, would be only one among many expressions of this historical pattern. The narrative shifts the focus from exception to recurrence at a phenomenon.
Ancient paganism comes to be interpreted as a system formed by multiple sacralized human histories. The island of Panchaea serves as an interpretive key for this broader framework. The political organization described on the island also plays a central role in the construction of religious belief. Institutional power contributes to the preservation of records and the maintenance of the cult of the gods. Kings, priests, and administrators act as mediators of collective memory, ensuring its continuity. Divinization does not occur spontaneously, but within well-defined social structures. Ancient religion thus appears linked to political stability and institutional authority. Ritual veneration reinforces present power by anchoring it in the prestige of the past. The narrative of Panchaea shows how history, politics, and religion intertwine. This intertwining is fundamental for the functioning of euhemerism. By concluding the description of the island of Panchaea, Euhemeris establishes a narrative model that connects the origin of the gods, human memory, and the cult of ancestors. The account is not intended merely as a local story, but as a general explanation for the formation of ancient mythology. The construction of myth appears as a gradual process sustained by records, rituals, and cultural transmission. Religious belief consolidates as collective memory becomes institutionalized. The island functions as a narrative evidence that the divine can emerge from the human over time. This model remains open to application in other religious traditions. From this foundation, euhemerism prepares to engage with historical contexts beyond the Greek world.
The core idea of euhemerism is structured around the notion that the gods do not emerge as isolated supernatural entities, but as human figures who gradually acquire divine status over time. According to this logic, heroes and kings perform political, military, or administrative roles that leave a deep mark on their communities. These deeds are preserved by human memory, initially as historical remembrance and later as narrative tradition. Over generations, the repetition of these stories amplifies their symbolic importance. Religious belief forms when this memory ceases to be mere recollection and becomes the object of ritual veneration. The cult of the gods, at this point, no longer clearly distinguishes between the human and the divine. Euhemerism organizes this transition as a gradual and historical process. Thus, the origin of the gods is placed within collective human experience. Within this model, the death of the historical figure does not end their social presence, but inaugurates a new stage of symbolic existence. The physical absence of the ruler or hero creates space for the progressive idealization of their figure. Human memory preserves specific deeds, but also selects, expands, and reorganizes narratives according to the needs of the community. Ritual veneration emerges as a mechanism for fixing this memory, ensuring its continuity over time. Festivals, cults, and celebrations function as devices of repetition and reinforcement of religious belief. Ancient religion in this reading arises from constant practice rather than from a single founding event. Euhemerism describes divinization as a direct result of this ritual accumulation. The divine is constructed through the persistence of remembrance. Political power plays a central role within this euhemerist logic. Kings and leaders not only accomplish notable deeds, but also establish institutions that preserve their memory after death. Temples, records, genealogies, and oral traditions act as extensions of the power exercised in life. Divinization reinforces past authority and at the same time legitimizes present authority. The cult of ancestors integrates with the cult of the gods, forming a continuity between human governance and ancient religion. Ancient mythology, in this context, reflects sacralized political history. Euhemerism interprets the pantheon as a symbolic archive of former leaderships. Religious belief thus comes to function as institutionalized memory of power.
Within Greek mythology, this pattern can be observed in the way different gods are associated with specific functions of social life. Deities linked to war, agriculture, or legislation reflect concrete human activities exercised by heroes and kings of the past. Euhemerism does not deny the existence of the cult of the gods, but proposes a historical genealogy for its formation. Ancient mythology thus appears as an accumulated narrative of human experiences transformed into sacred symbols. Human memory acts as an organizing element to these narratives, connecting past and present. The cult of ancestors serves as a bridge between family history and public religion. Greek mythology, in this sense, preserves successive layers of memory. Euhemerism organizes these layers into a comprehensible historical sequence. Ancient religion emerges as the product of this long duration. By systematizing these elements, euhemerism offers a comprehensive explanation for the origin of the gods within the history of religions. The theory is not limited to a specific case, but proposes a pattern applicable to different cultures of the ancient world. Heroes and kings, human memory, ritual veneration, and divinization form a continuous logical chain. Ancient mythology comes to be interpreted as the result of identifiable social processes. The cult of the gods is revealed as a structured historical practice rather than an isolated phenomenon. This core idea establishes the conceptual foundation for later applications of euhemerism. From this point onward, the theory becomes capable of engaging with other religious traditions and historical contexts.
Long before euhemerists organized this theory in a systematic way, traditions already existed in the Greek world that questioned the absolute divine nature of the gods. These ideas circulated mainly through local accounts, oral traditions, and regional narratives that diverged from dominant Greek mythology. In different cities and islands, alternative versions of the origin of the gods were preserved by human memory. These versions did not deny the cult of the gods, but offered different explanations for their emergence. Ancient religion, in this context, was not a uniform system, but a set of beliefs constantly adapting. Ancient paganism coexisted with varied interpretations of divinity. This plural environment allowed readings that associated the gods with human figures of the past to emerge. One of the most well-known examples of these earlier traditions is the Cretan belief in the existence of the tomb of Zeus. In Crete, there circulated a narrative that Zeus had lived as a human ruler, and after his death had been buried on the island. This tradition directly contrasted with the more widespread Greek mythology, which presented Zeus as immortal and eternal. The very existence of a tomb attributed to the god called his absolute divine nature into question. For some Greeks, this idea was scandalous. For others, it was part of local cultural heritage. Human memory preserved this alternative version through rituals, stories, and geographic references. The cult of the gods, in this case, coexisted with the notion of a human origin. This tension reveals that questioning was already present before formal euhemerism. The Cretan tradition was not seen merely as divergent, but often as problematic by defenders of traditional mythology. Ancient authors went so far as to accuse the Cretans of being liars for claiming that Zeus had died. These accusations showed that debate over the origin of the gods was known and controversial. Labeling a group as liars or atheists did not imply the absence of religion, but disagreement over its form. Ancient paganism, far from being homogeneous, included internal disputes over the nature of the divine. Religious belief was shaped both by tradition and by interpretive conflict. Ancient mythology thus reflected multiple layers of understanding. This scenario prepared the intellectual ground for later ideas such as euhemerism. These accusations also reveal an important aspect of the history of religions, the struggle for authority over collective memory.
By affirming Zeus's immortality, certain groups sought to preserve a specific narrative of the divine. By affirming that Zeus had been human, others preserved an alternative memory linked to local history. Human memory thus became a field of symbolic dispute. The cult of the gods was not only a religious practice, but also a cultural and identity-based affirmation. Ancient religion functioned as a means of social organization and legitimation of regional traditions. Conflict between versions did not annul the cult, but multiplied it. This process shows how divinization could take different paths depending on context. Beyond Crete, other regions of the Greek world preserved similar stories, in which heroes and kings were remembered as founders, lawgivers, or protectors who were later divinized. These figures occupied intermediate positions between the human and the divine, becoming objects of ritual veneration without fully fitting into the traditional Olympian pantheon. The cult of ancestors played a central role in this process, linking family lineages to public religion. Greek mythology incorporated these figures through narratives that blended history and myth. Religious belief adapted in order to include these local memories. Ancient paganism thus revealed a flexible structure. Euhemerism would find in these traditions a terrain already prepared. The circulation of these earlier ideas shows that euhemerists did not create his theory from nothing, but gathered dispersed narratives, regional traditions, and ancient critiques into a coherent explanatory model. Ancient mythology, viewed from this perspective, already contained elements of rationalization before philosophical formulation. Human memory acted as a connecting thread between different versions of the origin of the gods. The cult of the gods remained active even when reinterpreted historically. Ancient religion demonstrated the capacity to absorb diverse readings without dissolving. This context explains why euhemerism found resonance. It systematized what some groups had already intuitively accepted. By examining euhemerism before euhemeris, it becomes possible to understand the theory as the culmination of a broader historical process.
The figure of the historical Zeus begins to gain space in Greek thought when different traditions start to be compared and placed in dialogue. Within traditional Greek mythology, Zeus was presented as the supreme, immortal, and eternal deity, governing both the cosmos and human order. However, regional accounts and critical interpretations introduced the possibility of a different trajectory for this central figure. The idea that Zeus may have lived as a human ruler before being divinized circulated alongside the established cult of the gods. This coexistence of versions did not eliminate the cult, but generated questions about its origin. Ancient religion, in this context, became a space of interpretive debate. Human memory began to be observed as an active element in the formation of religious belief. Greek criticism did not develop in a uniform manner, but through comments, fragments, and observations preserved in diverse texts. Poets, historians, and thinkers reflected on the internal coherence of mythological narratives, comparing conflicting versions. When Zeus appeared as a figure with birth, political actions, and even death in certain traditions, this clashed with his immortal Olympian image. This tension stimulated reflections on how myths were formed and transmitted. Ancient mythology ceased to be merely an object of ritual veneration and became also an object of analysis. Ancient paganism thus revealed an internal capacity for self-criticism. The origin of the gods became a legitimate subject of discussion. Within this critical environment, the notion of a historical Zeus functioned as a point of support for rationalized interpretations of Greek mythology. By treating Zeus as a former king, a lawgiver, certain authors brought the divine closer to the human. This approximation did not aim to abolish religion, but to reorganize its understanding. The cult of the gods remained active, yet was reinterpreted as the result of historical processes.
human memory was seen as responsible for preserving real deeds and amplifying them over time. Ritual veneration, in this sense, consolidated narratives that had already been transformed by tradition. Greek criticism began to map this transformation. The historical Zeus became a central example of this mechanism. These critical readings also revealed concerns about the moral and logical coherence of mythological narratives. By observing contradictions between versions, some thinkers sought explanations that did not rely exclusively on the supernatural. The divinization of heroes and kings offered a model comprehensible within human experience. Ancient mythology could then be read as a symbolic record of historical events reinterpreted over time. Religious belief remained, but with a new explanatory layer. The cult of the gods came to coexist with awareness of their possible human origin. This dual level of reading characterized Greek critical thought. Ancient paganism appeared more complex than a closed dogmatic system. Reactions to these interpretations were not uniform and varied according to social and political contexts. In some settings, the reading of a historical Zeus was tolerated as local tradition or intellectual reflection. In others, it was seen as a threat to established religious order. Accusations of impiety or atheism arose when criticism seemed to weaken the cult of the gods. Even so, such accusations did not prevent the circulation of ideas. The history of religions records this constant clash between tradition and interpretation. Human memory continued to preserve multiple versions of the divine. Greek criticism, far from extinguishing ancient religion, contributed to its internal diversity. Because Zeus occupied a central position in the pantheon, he became a privileged target of these discussions. Questioning the origin of Zeus meant questioning the very structure of Greek mythology. For this reason, the idea of a historical Zeus carried broad symbolic reach. It allowed the same reasoning to be extended to other deities, reinforcing the logic of euhemerism. Divinization ceased to be an exception and came to be seen as a recurring pattern. The cult of the gods appeared as a continuation of the cult of ancestors and leaders of the past. Ancient religion thus revealed a deeply historical foundation. This reading prepared the ground for later systematizations. By consolidating criticism around the historical Zeus, Greek thought opened space for broader explanations of the origin of the gods. Ancient mythology came to be understood as a progressive construction shaped by memory, ritual, and power. Religious belief was not denied, but contextualized within collective human experience. Ancient paganism demonstrated the capacity to absorb questioning without disappearing. Greek criticism functioned as a mechanism of internal reflection within religion itself. The historical Zeus synthesized this movement between tradition and analysis. From this point onward, euhemerism encountered an intellectual field already mature for its systematic formulation.
After the conquests of Alexander, Jewish communities began to live continuously in urban centers shaped by the Greek language, philosophy, and ancient mythology. Cities such as Alexandria became spaces of coexistence between distinct religious traditions, where Jews maintained ancestral practices while engaging with Hellenic thought. This contact did not erase Jewish identity, but introduced new vocabularies and intellectual categories. Ancient Jewish religion began to be expressed also in Greek, opening the way for translations and adapted interpretations. The collective human memory of these communities had to reconcile different heritages. The cult of biblical ancestors remained central, but came to be explained in terms intelligible to the Hellenistic world. This multicultural environment shaped new forms of religious reflection. Within Hellenistic Judaism, texts and traditions began to dialogue with concepts present in the history of religions of the Greek world. Jewish authors employed literary styles, philosophical arguments, and historical examples common to the Hellenic environment.
The ancient mythology of neighboring peoples was not adopted, but critically examined. Jewish religious belief was presented as distinct, yet intelligible within a comparative framework. In this process, the origin of pagan gods came to be discussed as the product of human practices, collective memory, and ritual veneration. The ancient religion of other peoples was observed from a distance, but was shared conceptual tools. Hellenistic Judaism thus positioned itself within a broad cultural debate. Criticism was not isolated, but historically contextualized. This cultural contact led Jewish authors to reflect on how divinities were formed and maintained in the collective imagination. The idea that kings, heroes, and figures of power could be divinized found parallels in the observation of foreign cults. Human memory appeared as a decisive factor in transforming historical figures into objects of ritual veneration. The cult of pagan gods was described as the result of emotional and social processes accumulated over time. This reading did not alter the internal structure of Jewish religion, but provided an external critical lens. The history of religions became an instrument of cultural distinction. Hellenistic Judaism explained the other in order to affirm its own identity. This intellectual movement broadened the scope of religious reflection. The use of the Greek language was a central element in this process of cultural mediation. Writing in Greek made it possible to address readers formed by philosophy and Greek mythology directly. Concepts such as divinization, the cult of the gods, and ritual veneration gained linguistic equivalents that facilitated comparison. The translation of sacred texts was not merely linguistic, but conceptual. The human memory recorded in these writings had to be reorganized for a new audience. Ancient Jewish religion, when presented in this context, asserted its antiquity and historical continuity. At the same time, it offered an implicit critique of neighboring religions. Hellenistic Judaism became an active participant in the Mediterranean cultural debate. Within this environment, observation of pagan cults led to the formulation of historical explanations for their origin. The divinization of human figures was seen as a recurrent phenomenon among different peoples. Heroes and kings transformed into gods appeared as the result of processes similar to those described by euhemerism. Human memory, by preserving deeds and expanding narratives, created figures increasingly distant from their historical origin. Ritual veneration institutionalized these memories, ensuring their permanence. The cult of biblical ancestors was recognized as a common point of departure. This historical reading reinforced the distinction between ancient Jewish religion and ancient pagan mythology. Cultural contact thus produced comparative analysis. Hellenistic Judaism also faced the challenge of explaining its own practices in a plural environment. The absence of images, the centrality of the law, and the relationship with a single God had to be communicated to an audience accustomed to the pantheon. To do so, Jewish authors turned to history and memory as foundations of religious belief. The antiquity of the tradition was presented as an element of legitimacy. The cult of biblical ancestors was described as the preservation of historical memory, not as human divinization. This distinction was carefully elaborated in texts and arguments. The history of religion served as a field of comparison and differentiation. Hellenistic Judaism consolidated its identity within this dialogue. At the end of this process, Hellenistic Judaism appears as a space of synthesis between preservation and cultural adaptation. Contact with Greek mythology and with theories about the origin of the gods did not dissolve Jewish tradition, but stimulated new ways of explaining and defending it. Human memory, the cult of ancestors, and ritual veneration were concepts observed and critically reinterpreted. Ancient religion came to be analyzed within a broader historical framework. This intellectual environment prepared the ground for specific applications of euhemerism in Jewish texts. Cultural interaction was transformed into a tool of historical analysis. From this point onward, these ideas would begin to appear more explicitly in Jewish literary production.
The Book of the Wisdom of Solomon emerges within Hellenistic Judaism as a text that directly engages the Greek cultural environment. Written in Greek, it addresses readers familiar with ancient mythology and philosophical explanations for the origin of the gods. In this setting, the text does not merely reaffirm Jewish traditions, but proposes a historical analysis of the religious beliefs of neighboring peoples. Ancient pagan religion is described as the result of identifiable human processes. Human memory occupies a central position in this explanation, functioning as a mechanism for preserving and expanding narratives. The cult of the gods appears linked to concrete social practices. The Wisdom of Solomon thus enters the debate within the history of religions. The text offers a structured reading and a construction of myth. One of the most well-known passages of the Wisdom describes the origin of a divinity arising from a father's mourning for the premature death of his son. According to the account, grief leads the father to preserve the image of the deceased child, initially as a private remembrance. Over time, this memory becomes an object of ritual veneration. Human memory, marked by emotion, begins to organize symbolic practices around the figure of the dead. What begins as an intimate gesture expands into the public sphere. Religious belief emerges from the repetition of these gestures across generations. Ancient religion in this example is presented as the product of common human experiences. The text describes this process in a progressive and historical manner. This narrative aligns directly with the logic of euhemerism. The account continues by showing how political power contributes to the consolidation of this cult. Rulers and authorities begin to institutionalize veneration, transforming it into an obligatory collective practice. Images are produced, rituals are organized, and the individual's memory is officially preserved. Divinization ceases to be merely the result of mourning and becomes integrated into structures of power. The cult of the gods becomes an instrument of social cohesion and symbolic control. Human memory is reinforced by norms, ceremonies, and institutions. Religious belief stabilizes when supported by political authority. The Wisdom of Solomon describes this process without resorting to moral judgments. The text remains within the field of historical explanation. In this context, ritual veneration appears as a fundamental element in the transformation of the human into the divine. Festivals, sacrifices, and periodic celebrations ensure the continuity of memory over time. Ritual repetition transforms remembrance into tradition. Ancient religion consolidates when these practices are transmitted from generation to generation. Ancient mythology in this reading emerges as the accumulation of these repeated practices. The text presents religious belief as a gradual construction, not as a sudden revelation. The cult of ancestors functions as the starting point of this process. Divinization is described as the logical consequence of the persistence of human memory. This narrative structure clearly reflects euhemerist reasoning. The Wisdom of Solomon expands the argument by observing that this mechanism is not limited to a single case. The origin of pagan gods is presented as a recurring result of similar processes in different societies. Heroes, kings, and prominent figures are transformed into objects of cult through collective memory. Ancient mythology appears as a symbolic record of these human trajectories. Religious belief adapts to the social and emotional needs of communities. The text suggests that the cult of the gods responds to universal experiences, such as loss, authority, and tradition. The history of religions at this point is treated as a comparative field.
Hellenistic Judaism observes the other in order to explain its differences. This historical approach strengthens the coherence of the argument. By employing this explanation, the text does not redefine Jewish religion itself, but establishes a clear distinction between historical tradition and human divinization. The memory of biblical ancestors is presented as historical preservation, not as elevation to divine status. The cult of ancestors in this case remains separate from divinization. Jewish religious belief is grounded in the continuity of law and tradition, not in the transformation of men into gods. The wisdom of Solomon articulates this distinction through historical examples. Cultural contact with the Greek world requires this comparative explanation. The text responds to the intellectual categories of the Hellenistic environment. Ancient Jewish religion affirms itself within this dialogue. At the conclusion of this analysis, the wisdom of Solomon stands as one of the clearest examples of euhemerist reasoning applied outside the Greek context. The text organizes mourning, power, human memory, and ritual veneration into a coherent historical sequence. The construction of myth is described as an identifiable and repeatable process. The religious belief of neighboring peoples is explained through human and social factors. This historical approach reinforces a historical reading of the origin of the gods. Hellenistic Judaism at this point appears fully integrated into the debate of the history of religions. The application of euhemerism takes on literary and argumentative form. From here onward, this logic would begin to be reused in other religious contexts as well. The cult of ancestors appears recurrently in various societies of the ancient world as a practice aimed at preserving human memory. Families, clans, and communities maintained rituals dedicated to the remembrance of forebears considered founders, protectors, or benefactors. These practices were not limited to private remembrance, but assumed a public and collective character. Ancient religion incorporated these memories through regular ceremonies, festivals, and spaces dedicated to ritual veneration. The past was kept alive through repeated gestures and narratives transmitted over time. Religious belief consolidated when these practices became stable and enduring. The cult of ancestors functioned as a link between family history and collective identity. In this context, human memory structured social continuity. These cults did not emerge spontaneously, but were organized within well-defined social structures. Tombs, domestic altars, and local sanctuaries served as material points of reference for ritual veneration. The physical presence of these spaces reinforced the permanence of memory in everyday life. Ancient religion used these locations as means of integrating past and present. The cult of ancestors established a direct relationship between the living and the dead, mediated by formal rituals. The repetition of these practices across generations expanded the symbolic reach of the ancestors. Human memory in this process ceased to be individual and became collective. The cult affirmed itself as a continuous tradition. Over time, certain ancestral figures acquired greater prominence than others. Political leaders, military chiefs, and city founders were remembered in a differentiated manner within the cult. Their deeds were narrated more frequently, and their images occupied a central place in ceremonies. Intensified ritual veneration produced a symbolic elevation of these figures. Divinization emerged when human memory attributed protective or mediating functions to these ancestors. In many cases, the cult of the gods developed from this intermediate stage. Ancient religion incorporated these figures into its symbolic system. The cult of ancestors thus became a foundation for the formation of local pantheons. This process did not eliminate the initial distinction between human and divine, but gradually rendered it less clear. Human memory selected, expanded, and reinterpreted past deeds according to the needs of the community. Ritual veneration reinforced these narratives through constant repetition. Religious belief adjusted to this accumulation of sacralized memories. Ancient mythology preserved traces of this process by presenting gods with histories, genealogies, and specific territorial connections. The cult of ancestors explained the closeness between divinities and local communities. Ancient religion thus revealed its historical and social dimension. Euhemerism found in this mechanism an observable foundation. In different regions of the ancient world, the cult of ancestors assumed varied forms, adapted to local cultural structures. In some societies, veneration remained restricted to the family sphere. In others, it was integrated into state religion. The transition from one level to another depended on the importance attributed to the ancestor and on the institutionalization of the cult. When political authorities incorporated these practices, human memory was reinforced by laws and public rituals. Ritual veneration gained collective and lasting reach. Ancient religion structured itself around this integration of power and memory. The cult of the gods in this scenario appeared as an extension of the cult of ancestors. History of religions records this pattern repeatedly. Intergenerational transmission played a central role in the persistence of these cults. Each generation inherited narratives already shaped and adapted them to their own historical context. Time acted as a transforming element, softening human aspects and reinforcing extraordinary attributes. The construction of myth occurred within this continuous process of transmission and adaptation. Religious belief consolidated when these narratives became part of education and collective identity. The cult of ancestors functioned as a mechanism of cultural continuity. Human memory ensured the symbolic survival of the past. Ancient religion emerged as the result of this long duration. By observing the cult of ancestors within the history of religions, it becomes possible to understand its structural role in the origin of the gods. Divinization does not appear as an isolated event, but as the culmination of practices of memory and ritual veneration. Heroes and kings occupy central positions in this process because they concentrate significant collective memories. The cult of the gods is revealed as an advanced stage of the cult of ancestors. Ancient mythology preserves traces of this trajectory in its narratives. Ancient religion organizes itself as a historical system for preserving human memory. This understanding expands the euhemerist reading beyond specific cases. From this point onward, the analysis prepares to examine how this pattern was reused in later religious contexts.
In the first centuries of the Common Era, Christian communities developed in environments deeply marked by ancient Greco-Roman religion. Temples, festivals, and images of the gods were part of everyday urban life, while the cult of the gods coexisted with civic and political practices. Authors of early Christianity wrote in Greek and Latin to engage this broad audience. Their texts sought to explain pagan religious belief using historical and rational categories already familiar to their readers. Ancient mythology was presented as the result of human processes accumulated over time. Human memory appeared as a decisive factor in preserving these narratives. The criticism did not focus solely on mythic content, but extended to its historical origin. In this way, early Christianity entered the debate within the history of religions. These authors described the Greek and Roman gods as figures associated with historical characters from the past. Kings, lawgivers, and heroes were presented as real men who, after death, underwent processes of divinization. Ritual veneration kept the memory of these individuals alive, transforming human beings into divine attributes. The cult of the gods was explained as a continuation of the cult of ancestors and collective memory. Ancient religion, in this framework, emerged as an identifiable historical construction. Pagan religious belief was analyzed without resorting to supernatural explanations. This type of argument aligned with the logic of euhemerism. Early Christianity employed these readings to engage with the existing cultural environment. Christian criticism also relied on the internal diversity of pagan traditions to support its arguments. Contradictory versions of the same gods were gathered as evidence of local and human origins. Ancient mythology appeared fragmented according to regions and cities, reinforcing the idea of historical formation. Human memory, by preserving distinct narratives, produced multiple images of the divine. Ritual veneration fixed these versions within specific contexts. The cult of the gods thus reflected local histories elevated to the sacred level. Ancient religion was described as a plural and cumulative system. This panorama strengthened the historical critique developed by Christian authors. The debate remained within the explanatory field. In this context, divinization was presented as a gradual process sustained by social and political practices. Civil authorities played a significant role by institutionalizing cults and festivities. Ritual repetition reinforced collective memory and expanded the symbolic reach of the figures venerated. Religious belief consolidated when supported by public norms and traditions. Early Christianity observed these mechanisms as part of the organization of the pagan world. Ancient religion was understood as the product of long historical duration. The cult of the gods appeared linked to structures of power and civic identity. This historical reading made it possible to explain the persistence of paganism. The argument remained within the logic of the history of religions. Christian authors also drew on parallels with practices known in other cultures to reinforce their analysis. The cult of ancestors, common in different societies, was cited as a basis for understanding the formation of pantheons. Heroes and kings transformed into gods followed recurring patterns observable in multiple contexts. Human memory operated as a universal element in the sacralization of the past. Ritual veneration ensured continuity across generations. Ancient mythology preserved traces of these transformations in its narratives. Ancient religion could thus be analyzed comparatively. Early Christianity presented itself as an active participant in this interpretive field. The criticism remained historically structured. In formulating this critique of paganism, Christian authors also needed to explain their own presence within the Roman religious world. Texts described early Christianity as a tradition distinct from religions based on human divinization. The central figure of Christian faith was presented within a specific historical narrative, separate from pagan gods. Even so, the analysis of neighboring cults employed shared categories such as memory, ritual, and transmission. The history of religions provided the necessary vocabulary for the debate. Religious belief was treated as an observable historical phenomenon. Dialogue with paganism occurred on an intellectual and cultural level. Early Christianity defined itself within this explanatory confrontation. As a result, Christian criticism of paganism contributed to the circulation and adaptation of ideas close to euhemerism. The origin of the gods was described as the outcome of recurring human processes identifiable over time. Ancient religion appeared as a system built by human memory, ritual veneration, and institutional power. The cult of the gods was integrated into comparative historical analysis. This framework did not close the debate, but expanded its possibilities. The history of religions gained a new chapter with Christian participation. Early Christianity employed critical tools inherited from the ancient world. From this point onward, these same categories would begin to be applied to internal discussions about the faith itself.
Cyprian of Carthage was active during the 3rd century, within a context strongly influenced by the traditional religious structures of the Roman world in North Africa. Cities in this region were fully integrated into Greco-Roman culture, marked by temples, public ceremonies, and officially recognized religious traditions. In this setting, early Christianity developed alongside long-established civic customs. Cyprian wrote in Latin and addressed both social and administrative authorities of the empire. His writings sought to interpret traditional religious narratives through historically identifiable frameworks. Religious traditions were treated as outcomes of human and social development. Human memory played a central role in maintaining these narratives over time. Cyprian's approach operated within broader discussions found in the historical study of religions. In his texts, figures traditionally regarded as divine were described as individuals who had lived in earlier periods. Leaders, rulers, and heroic figures appeared as historical persons whose actions were gradually amplified through collective remembrance. After their deaths, these individuals began to receive honors that increased across generations. Ritual practices preserved their memory within communities. Over time, the boundary between commemoration and reverence became progressively blurred. The elevation of these figures followed a gradual historical process. Religious traditions were explained as extensions of ancestral remembrance. Within this framework, ancient belief systems assumed a recognizable historical structure. Cyprian also emphasized the role of political organization in reinforcing these traditions. Civic authorities supported public ceremonies, constructed monuments, and regulated ritual practices connected to respected historical figures. These actions strengthened collective memory through official and communal participation. Belief systems became more stable when supported by public institutions. Religious practices were woven into everyday civic life and social identity. In this way, traditional religion became closely linked to political organization. Cyprian described this development as historically observable. His analysis focused on explanation rather than denial. The argument remained grounded in historical reasoning. Another recurring theme in his writings was the existence of multiple versions regarding the origins and actions attributed to revered figures. Cyprian compared differing regional accounts to highlight variation across communities. These narratives differed according to location and tradition. Such diversity suggested localized historical origins rather than universal foundations. Human memory preserved distinct versions adapted to specific social contexts. Religious practices helped fix these narratives within particular communities. Religious traditions reflected localized histories elevated through time. Ancient belief systems thus appeared as cumulative and diverse structures. Cyprian used these observations to reinforce his historical interpretation. Cyprian also drew comparisons with practices observed in other societies. Ancestral remembrance appeared as a widespread cultural pattern. The elevation of figures from the past into objects of communal reverence followed similar historical dynamics. Human memory functioned as a recurring mechanism in shaping these traditions. The symbolic elevation of leaders and heroes emerged as a predictable outcome of this process. Mythological narratives preserved traces of these long-term transformations. Comparative analysis provided a broader framework for understanding these developments. Cyprian's reasoning remained descriptive and analytical. His discourse aligned with historical inquiry. At the same time, Cyprian positioned early Christianity within this diverse religious environment. His writings distinguished Christian belief from traditions based on the historical elevation of past figures. Even so, his analysis employed shared concepts such as memory, ritual transmission, and social continuity. Religious belief was approached as a historical phenomenon. Engagement with traditional religion occurred on an explanatory level rather than a symbolic one. Ancient belief systems were examined as social and historical constructions. Christianity was presented as a distinct tradition within this wider context. The analysis remained chronologically organized.
With Cyprian of Carthage, critical analysis of traditional religion reached a more structured and systematic form. The emergence of revered figures was explained through human memory, ritual continuity, and institutional reinforcement. Ancestral remembrance appeared as a foundational element in the development of complex religious systems. Traditional belief structures were incorporated into comparative historical study. This perspective echoed ideas similar to euhemeristic interpretations within early Christian thought. Mythological narratives were understood as products of long historical processes. Cyprian's analysis fits coherently within the broader history of religions. From this point onward, similar interpretive categories would also be applied to internal discussions concerning key figures within Christian tradition.
In the ancient world, Greeks, Jews, and Christians participated in the same Mediterranean intellectual space, even while maintaining distinct traditions. This contact enabled the circulation of similar interpretive categories to explain ancient religion. Greek ancient mythology, texts of Hellenistic Judaism, and writings of early Christianity engaged with common problems. Among them, the origin of the gods and the formation of religious belief held a central place. Human memory emerged as a shared element in the preservation of sacred narratives. Ritual veneration appeared as a mechanism of continuity over time. This methodological convergence established an interpretive symmetry among different traditions. Among the Greeks, critical reflection on Greek mythology led to the identification of historical processes in the formation of the gods. The figure of the historical Zeus exemplified readings of gods as divinized heroes and kings. Ancient Greek religion was analyzed through collective memory and the institutionalization of the cult of the gods. In Hellenistic Judaism, authors observed similar practices among neighboring peoples and explained the origin of pagan gods through mourning, power, and tradition. The Wisdom of Solomon described the construction of myth as a recognizable human process. In both cases, divinization appeared as a historical outcome. The symmetry was established in explanation, not in belief. In early Christianity, the same logic was applied systematically in criticism of ancient paganism. Christian authors described the gods as men of the past, elevated to divine status through human memory and ritual veneration. The cult of ancestors was identified as a common foundation for the formation of pantheons. Ancient religion was presented as the product of long historical duration. Although theological aims differed, the explanatory method remained similar. The history of religions provided a shared vocabulary. This methodological convergence reinforced the symmetry among the traditions. This symmetry did not imply religious agreement, but a sharing of interpretive tools. Greeks used these categories to reflect internally on their own ancient mythology. Hellenistic Jews employed them to explain and distinguish paganism in relation to their ancient religion. Christians reused them to critique pagan cults and situate their faith within the Greco-Roman world. In all cases, the origin of the gods was treated as a historical question. Religious belief was analyzed through memory, ritual, and transmission. The symmetry manifested in the structure of explanation. The content of faith remained distinct. The cult of ancestors functioned as a central point of convergence within this symmetry. Across different societies, the veneration of figures from the past sustained the continuity of collective memory. Heroes and kings transformed into gods followed observable patterns in multiple contexts. Divinization emerged as the culmination of practices repeated over time. Ancient mythology preserved traces of these transformations in its narratives. Ancient religion appeared as a historical system for sacralizing human memory. This reading enabled cross-cultural comparisons.
The symmetry was affirmed in pattern, not in doctrine. The history of religions, by recording these convergences, reveals the circulation of ideas and methods across distinct traditions. Euhemerism functioned as an interpretive key capable of moving between contexts. Its application varied according to purpose and audience, but maintained the same structural logic. Ritual veneration and the institutionalization of cult were described as universal elements. Human memory acted as the guiding thread of these analyses. Religious belief was understood within identifiable historical processes. The symmetry between Greeks, Jews, and Christians was consolidated at this analytical level. By establishing this symmetry, ancient debate prepared the ground for later applications of these same categories. The origin of the gods, the construction of myth, and the sacralization of human memory became comparable themes across traditions. Ancient religion ceased to be analyzed in isolation and began to be observed collectively. The history of religions gained comparative depth. This methodological convergence did not close the debate, but expanded its possibilities. From this point onward, the same tools would begin to be used in more specific analyses of concrete historical figures. Argumentative symmetry would open the way for later discussions on applying euhemerism in even more sensitive contexts.
In modern scholarship, euhemerism has come to be treated as a historical interpretive tool rather than a totalizing explanation of ancient religion. Historians and scholars of the history of religions recognize that the theory offers a plausible model for understanding certain specific phenomena. The divinization of rulers, emperors, and political leaders finds a direct parallel in euhemerist descriptions. Human memory, preserved through documents, monuments, and rituals, is identified as a central factor in this process. Ritual veneration institutionalizes these memories and ensures their continuity. Religious belief, in these cases, can be analyzed as an identifiable historical construction. Modern evaluation begins from the empirical observation of these data. Euhemerism is thus recognized as a partial method. Studies of the Roman imperial cult provide examples frequently cited in academic literature. Deceased emperors were officially elevated to divine status by decision of the state. Public ceremonies, temples, and priesthoods were organized to keep the ruler's memory alive. Ancient Roman religion incorporated these practices as part of its civic structure. Divinization occurred within well-documented administrative and symbolic processes. Human memory was reinforced by laws, coins, and inscriptions. Ritual veneration became an obligatory practice in certain contexts. For modern research, this case confirms the validity of euhemerism in specific situations. The model proves functional within this historical frame. Similar phenomena are observed in other ancient societies, such as Pharaonic Egypt. The figure of a pharaoh was associated with the divine already during life, but this association intensified after death. Funerary rituals, monuments, and texts preserved the memory of the ruler as a sacred being. Ancient Egyptian religion explicitly integrated political power and religious belief. Divinization was not the result of abstract myth, but of concrete and observable practices. Human memory operated as a mechanism for sacralizing power. Ritual veneration ensured the continuity of this image across generations. The history of religions identifies a recurring pattern in these cases. Euhemerism adequately explains this type of process. However, modern critical evaluation also points out clear limits to euhemerism. Complex mythological systems, such as Greek mythology as a whole, cannot be reduced solely to the divinization of historical figures. Cosmogonic narratives, natural symbols, and ritual structures present layers that exceed simple historical explanation. Ancient religion involves social, psychological, and symbolic functions that do not originate exclusively from human memory.
Ancient mythology articulates explanations about the world, nature, and social order. The cult of the gods fulfills roles that go beyond ancestor veneration. Religious belief is expressed in collective practices deeply rooted in society. Modern criticism recognizes these complexities. Euhemerism alone does not account for the entire phenomenon. For this reason, contemporary research integrates euhemerism with other analytical approaches. Anthropology contributes studies of rituals and social organization. Psychology investigates symbolic and emotional functions of religious belief. Sociology analyzes the relationship between religion, power, and collective identity. The history of religions brings these perspectives together to construct broader interpretive frameworks. Human memory remains a central but not exclusive element. Ritual veneration is understood within more complex symbolic systems. Divinization is seen as one among several possible processes. Modern evaluation seeks methodological balance. No single explanation is treated as sufficient. In this context, euhemerism remains relevant as a specific tool, applied with caution. It is used to analyze concrete cases of ancestor cults, heroes, and rulers. The origin of the gods in these examples can be historically traced with greater precision. Ancient mythology provides indications that dialogue with material and textual records. Religious belief is observed as a phenomenon constructed over time. Modern critical evaluation emphasizes the need for conceptual delineation. Euhemerism explains certain aspects, but not the totality of ancient religion. Its value lies in controlled application. The historical approach remains central. At the conclusion of this evaluation, modern research positions euhemerism as part of a broader set of analytical tools. Ancient religion is understood as a multifaceted phenomenon, involving human memory, ritual, symbolism, and social structure. Divinization appears as a recurring historical process, but not a universal one. Ritual veneration is analyzed within specific contexts. The history of religions benefits from this plural approach. Euhemerism continues to be debated, refined, and reapplied. Modern criticism does not discard it, but contextualizes it. From this point onward, these tools are used in analyses of concrete historical figures. This movement prepares the ground for more sensitive debates in the religious field.
In contemporary analysis, euhemerism is recognized for its specific scope, but also for its structural limitations. The theory proves effective when dealing with cults linked to identifiable historical characters, yet encounters difficulties when applied to broader religious systems. Many traditions of ancient religion present mythologies that are not organized around concrete human figures. Cosmogonic narratives, for example, address the origin of the world, natural elements, and cosmic order. These accounts do not depend on human memory of historical individuals. Ancient mythology often operates on symbolic levels that precede any political or biographical reference. Religious belief, in such cases, is not anchored in the veneration of heroes and kings. Euhemerism therefore does not provide a sufficient explanation for these contents. Another important limit emerges in the analysis of complex religious rituals. In many ancient societies, rituals were associated with agricultural cycles, astronomical phenomena, and seasonal changes. These ritual systems functioned independently of a memory of specific individuals. Ritual veneration was directed toward forces of nature or abstract principles rather than identifiable ancestors. Ancient religion, in this respect, organized social time and space. Ancient mythology provided narratives that explained the repetition of these cycles. Religious belief manifested as a structured collective practice. Euhemerism does not adequately explain the origin of these rituals. Its scope remains restricted to the historical biographical domain. The psychological functions of religion also escape euhemerist explanation.
Modern studies indicate that religious belief responds to human needs related to death, uncertainty, and social cohesion. Ancient mythology frequently offers symbolic models for dealing with suffering and finitude. These models do not necessarily derive from human memory of historical figures. Ancient religion creates narratives that organize subjective and collective experience. The cult of gods can function as a symbolic language for shared emotions and fears. The divinization of heroes and kings represents only one part of this phenomenon. Euhemerism does not fully encompass these psychological dimensions. Its focus remains limited to the historical origin of divine figures. There were also evident limits when considering the internal diversity of ancient mythologies. Complex pantheons present gods with overlapping functions, multiple genealogies, and contradictory attributes. These features are not easily explained by the transformation of historical individuals. Greek mythology, for instance, brings together regional narratives, natural symbols, and ancient ritual traditions. Human memory preserves these layers in a non-linear manner. Ancient religion results from the superposition of traditions over centuries. Religious belief adapts to different social and cultural contexts. Euhemerism does not explain this accumulated complexity. Its application tends to simplify dense religious systems. Modern criticism also observes that euhemerism does not adequately explain the persistence of gods with no clear connection to historical characters. Deities associated with the sky, earth, sea, or time do not present recognizable human biographies. Ritual veneration of these entities is linked to everyday experience with the natural environment. Ancient religion, in such cases, reflects a symbolic relationship with the physical world. Ancient mythology organizes these relationships through narratives that do not depend on kings or heroes. Religious belief is structured around forces perceived as permanent. Euhemerism offers no answer for the origin of these deities. Its field remains partial. Another identified limit lies in the long-term cultural transmission. Many religious traditions span extensive historical periods, adapting to political and social changes. Human memory in this process is constantly reworked. Ritual veneration can change form without losing symbolic continuity. Ancient religion demonstrates the capacity for transformation and resignification. The construction of myth occurs through accumulation and adaptation, not merely through the remembrance of individuals. Euhemerism tends to fix origins at an initial historical point. This fixation does not correspond to the dynamics observed in many religions. The history of religions points to more complex and continuous processes. In lighting these limits, modern critical evaluation positions euhemerism as an explanation valid only in delimited contexts. It contributes to understanding the divinization of heroes and kings and the role of ancestor cults. However, it does not explain the totality of ancient religion, nor the diversity of ancient mythology. Religious belief involves historical, symbolic, social, and psychological dimensions. Ritual veneration operates simultaneously on multiple levels. Human memory is an essential component, but not an exclusive one. Euhemerism remains a partial tool within the history of religions. From this recognition, analysis moves forward to examine how these limitations become central in debates concerning specific historical figures.
From the late 19th century, and above all throughout the 20th century, the study of ancient religion underwent significant methodological transformations. The history of religions ceased to seek single explanations and began to work with multiple interpretive keys. Researchers started to integrate archaeological data, literary texts, and ethnographic observations. Ancient mythology came to be analyzed as a complex symbolic system rather than merely as a distorted historical record. Religious belief was understood as a social and cultural phenomenon. Human memory remained relevant, but inserted into broader contexts. Ritual veneration began to be observed as a structuring practice of collective life. These changes expanded the field of historical analysis. Anthropology contributed decisively to these new approaches by studying religions in diverse societies. Rituals, myths, and symbolic practices were observed in operation, not only through ancient texts. Ancient religion began to be compared with living religious systems, revealing recurring patterns. Ancestor cults were analyzed as mechanisms of social cohesion and cultural transmission. Divinization ceased to be seen solely as historical error and began to be understood as a symbolic process. Ancient mythology gained new interpretive layers. Religious belief was related to social structures and everyday rituals. The history of religions became more comparative and less linear. Sociology also profoundly influenced the study of religion by highlighting its relationship with power, identity, and social organization. The cult of the gods came to be analyzed as an element of community integration. Ritual veneration was understood as a practice that reinforces hierarchies and belonging. Ancient religion came to be seen as an active part of political and social life. Human memory was preserved and shaped by institutions. The divinization of historical figures was interpreted as a process linked to authority and legitimacy. Ancient mythology reflected these social dynamics. Religious belief began to be analyzed within observable collective structures. Psychology offered another dimension to the study of religion by investigating the symbolic functions of belief. Myths and rituals began to be interpreted as ways of dealing with fear, death, and uncertainty. Ancient religion was understood as a symbolic language for universal human experiences. Ritual veneration organized collective and individual emotions. Ancient mythology provided narratives that gave meaning to the world and to existence. Human memory not only preserved facts, but constructed meanings. Divinization also came to be seen as a symbolic response to loss and suffering. The history of religions incorporated these readings in a complementary manner. Cultural history reinforced this perspective by analyzing religion as a product of long-term historical development. Religious traditions were studied in their processes of transformation over time. Ancient mythology came to be seen as the result of successive layers of interpretation. Religious belief adapted to social and political changes. Ritual veneration changed form without losing symbolic continuity. Human memory was constantly reworked. Ancient religion demonstrated the capacity to absorb new influences. Historical study began to emphasize processes rather than fixed origins. Within this plural framework, euhemerism was not abandoned but repositioned. It came to be used as a specific tool to analyze certain historical phenomena. The divinization of heroes, kings, and rulers continued to be effectively explained by this model. Ancestor cults remained a privileged field of application. However, euhemerism ceased to be treated as a universal explanation. The history of religions began to integrate it with other approaches. Human memory was understood as one among several elements at play. Analysis gained greater methodological balance. With these new approaches, the study of ancient religion became more complex and comprehensive. Ancient mythology came to be understood as a symbolic, historical, and social system at the same time. Religious belief was analyzed as a multifaceted phenomenon. Ritual veneration appeared as a central but not isolated practice. Divinization was inserted into varied contexts. The history of religions consolidated itself as an interdisciplinary field. These changes allowed for more careful and comparative analyses.
From this point onward, these tools would be applied to specific debates involving concrete historical figures, further expanding the scope of investigation.
In modern studies of early Christianity, the figure of the historical Jesus occupies a central position. Most academic research agrees on the existence of Jesus of Nazareth as a historical figure situated in first-century Judea. Christian and non-Christian sources record his public activity and his death. These records place Jesus within an environment marked by political tensions, Roman domination, and religious diversity. The history of religions came to distinguish between the historical individual and the tradition constructed afterward. This distinction became fundamental for critical analysis. Christian religious belief developed over time. Human memory played a central role in this process. From this distinction, some scholars began to observe parallels between early Christianity and patterns described by euhemerism. The starting point is the violent death of a charismatic leader. This traumatic event profoundly marked his followers. Human memory began to preserve and reinterpret his figure. Ritual veneration emerged within specific communities. Over time, narratives about deeds and teachings acquired new layers. The construction of myth occurred gradually. The process was neither instantaneous nor uniform. This pattern had already been observed in other ancient religious contexts. In early Christianity, the first groups reinterpreted the life and death of Jesus in light of Jewish scriptures. This movement occurred within Hellenistic Judaism, where debates about divinization and the cult of the gods already existed. Texts began to circulate among different communities. Oral transmission played a decisive role in this initial stage. Human memory reorganized lived events. Ritual veneration was expressed through regular communal practices. The figure of Jesus came to occupy a central place in these practices. The process was collective and progressive. As time passed, these traditions were recorded in written form. The Gospels reflect this stage of narrative consolidation. In them, the figure of the historical Jesus appeared integrated with theological elements. The construction of myth involved selection, organization, and interpretation of events. Ancient religion frequently operated in this manner. Early Christianity did not develop in isolation. It interacted with existing religious traditions. Divinization occurred within this specific cultural environment. Religious belief acquired a more defined structure. From a euhemerist perspective, this process presents clear parallels with other ancient cults. A historical man becomes the object of veneration. Human memory amplifies his importance. Ritual veneration becomes institutionalized. Over time, supernatural attributes are associated with the central figure. His pattern had already been described in ancestor cults and in the divinization of heroes and kings. Euhemerism does not deny historical existence. It focuses on later transformation. In this sense, the historical Jesus is inserted into a broader debate. The history of religions provides the comparative framework. At the same time, scholars also recognize the limits of this application. Early Christianity developed complex theologies that go beyond simple divinization. Eschatological, ethical, and symbolic elements played an important role. Christian ancient mythology interacted with Jewish and Hellenistic traditions. Religious belief was not reduced solely to the memory of an individual. Ritual veneration was integrated into a broader theological system. These factors expand the debate. Euhemerism functions as a partial analytical tool. For this reason, in modern debate, euhemerism is used as an analytical model rather than a total explanation. It helps explain how human memory and ritual veneration can transform historical figures.
In the case of the historical Jesus, this model is applied with caution. The history of religions analyzes the process without asserting definitive conclusions. The focus remains on historical reconstruction of facts and traditions. The construction of myth is understood as a gradual phenomenon. Christian religious belief emerges within this specific historical context. From this point, the narrative advances toward the closing of the overall argument, bringing together the elements presented throughout the journey.
Throughout this historical journey, euhemerism appeared as a theory that crossed different eras in religious traditions. Formulated in the Greek world as an explanation for the origin of the gods, it was based on the idea that human heroes and kings were transformed into divine figures through human memory. This proposal found space within ancient mythology, especially in contexts where the cult of the gods intertwined with ritual veneration of rulers and ancestors. From its formal emergence, euhemerism circulated as a recurring interpretive key. It did not remain confined to Greece, but was reinterpreted and reapplied in new cultural environments. In the contact between cultures, particularly within Hellenistic Judaism, the theory acquired new contours. Jewish texts engaged with Greek ideas to explain the emergence of cults and divine images. Ancient religion came to be analyzed as the result of historical and emotional processes linked to mourning, authority, and time. Human memory assumed a central role in preserving and expanding these narratives. Euhemerism, in this context, functioned as a critical tool to differentiate perceived true worship from human-origin cults. This adaptation demonstrated the theory's flexibility within the history of religions. In early Christianity, the same mechanism was used again, now as an instrument of critique against ancient paganism. Christian authors employed euhemerist arguments to assert that Greek and Roman gods had been divinized men. Divinization was presented as a historical process rather than a supernatural reality. This usage reinforced the symmetry between Greeks, Jews, and Christians in their employment of the theory. Each tradition used euhemerism according to its religious and cultural interests. The narrative pattern remained recognizable across these reapplications. In the advance of modern scholarship, euhemerism came to be evaluated in a critical and comparative way. Research in anthropology, sociology, psychology, and cultural history showed that ancient religion cannot be explained by a single model. Ancient mythology revealed complex symbolic layers, rituals connected to nature, and broad social functions. Religious belief came to be understood as a multifaceted phenomenon. In this context, euhemerism retained relevance but ceased to occupy an absolute central position. It became integrated into a broader set of approaches. The return of the theory to debates about the historical Jesus occurred within this plural academic context. The consensus regarding the historical existence of Jesus allowed comparative analyses with other known processes of divinization. Human memory, ritual veneration, and the construction of myth were examined as historical elements. Euhemerism was used as an analytical model to understand transformations following the death of religious leaders. At the same time, its limits were recognized in light of the theological complexity of early Christianity. The theory thus operated as a partial tool rather than a total explanation. In this way, euhemerism returns to contemporary debate not as a definitive answer, but as a critical instrument. It helps identify recurring historical patterns in the relationship between human figures and religious belief. The history of religions uses this theory to illuminate specific processes of divinization and ancestor cults. The value of euhemerism lies in its capacity to provoke comparative and historical analysis. Its return demonstrates the persistence of ancient questions within modern debates. The theory continues to be revisited, reinterpreted, and discussed over time. If you like this video, don't forget to leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell to receive more videos like this. So that's it. Hope you enjoyed the video. Write in the comments which topics or videos you'd like to see next here on the channel. And if you're interested in this kind of subject, take a look at the video, Who Were the Forbidden Children of Angels and Humans in the Bible, which might interest you as well. Thank you very much for watching until the end, and see you in the next one.